free market. You can't separate government from the free market. Government is defining the market. And that's the problem, because with all this money coming in, you're buying off the people who are organizing the market for the advantage of the people who are already getting benefits. And when that happens, you see, you create this giant, vicious cycle in which people at the top who are already doing extraordinarily well are using some of their money to rig the market and make it so that they'll do even better. Do you understand how the compounding of this works? I mean, look at Wall Street. Wall Street, now remember, it was boring. It used to be boring. Wall Street was unleashed, and I'm embarrassed to say that some of that unleashing happened, not on my watch, thank goodness I was gone, but under the Clinton administration. We got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, I want you to say, now, Hillary Clinton is I've known her since she was 19 years old, but when she comes to town, you just ask her, are you going to resurrect the Glass-Steagall Act? Or how about the biggest banks? Now, this is an important little statistics, and I hate to give you statistics because statistics are pretty boring, but I want to give you this. In 1990, the top biggest 5 banks on Wall Street had 10% of total banking assets. Today, after the big bank explosion, after we went through everything with the Great Recession, today the 5 biggest banks on Wall Street have 45% of total banking assets. They're much bigger than they were even in 2008. So if we have a meltdown, which are we going to have? Are we likely to have? Because, the big banks have been lobbying and successfully lobbying to roll back the Dodd-Frank Act. So the big banks are almost back to the kind of gambling they were doing before. If we have another too-big-to-fail bank, it's going to be even a bigger failure. And what happens to middle class? What happens to poor people? What happens to the rest of us if we go through another one of those people losing their homes, losing their jobs, losing their savings? We're not going to do that again. We must not do that again. So when Hillary comes to town, or Bernie, or anybody else, or any Republican you happen to see tonight at their dinner, what I want you to say are you willing to bust up the big banks? Use antitrust and bust up the big banks. These are real specific questions I want you to ask. Seriously. I mean, you in Iowa, the reason I came to Iowa is because you guys get to ask the questions. I don't. I'm in California. I don't even see anybody. You think a single presidential candidate ever comes to California? Yeah, they come to troll for millionaire money occasionally, because there's some millionaire Democrats in California, but they don't come to talk to anybody. Your house is for sale in Iowa? Come here. I'm here. But you Iowans, wait a minute. Wait, this is a very boisterous. You are a. What you have to do, I'm trying to help you. What you have to do is you've got to ask very specific, pointed questions. Not kind of, are you worried about the middle class? No, you've got to be really specific. I mean, in terms of labor unions. What are you going to do to strengthen labor unions? Exactly. Are you going to resurrect? Are you going to try to get the Free Choice Act? Are you going to do that? Are you going to go after companies that try to bust unions? Are you going to make sure that no federal contractor who has tried to bust unions can ever be a federal contractor again? Are you going to do that? You see, you've got to be You've got to be specific. You're going to raise the minimum wage? Are you actually going to raise the minimum wage at least to what it was in 1968? If not, I mean, if you added productivity improvements since 1968, the minimum wage today, hold your seats. I'm not advocating this, but I'm just telling you something. Because the typical American worker today is much, much, much more productive. Even a McDonald's worker is surrounded by much more machinery. The typical American worker today is far more productive than he or she was in 1968. So if you add in productivity improvements since 1968, adjust for them and for inflation, you know what the minimum wage would be today in this country? It would be $21 an hour. Now again, I'm realistic enough to think no, that would get people too nervous. But think of that. Think of that. So you say to the candidates, are you at least willing? You know, maybe it's got to be over 3 years. Are you going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and adjust for inflation thereafter? You know, the other side, this is a debate, by the way. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Republicans are not our enemies. Can I just I know I look at your faces, you're so skeptical when I say that. No, they're not your enemies. They're not your enemies. The enemies we are progressives. The enemies are the people who want to take us back to the 19th century. They are regressives. They are regressives. Now, a lot of Republicans are regressives. There's some Democrats I've met who are regressives. There are a few Republicans, there used to be, they're now a vanishing species, progressives. Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, you have to go back a little bit to find them. But what progressives are talking about, we are talking about moving this nation forward with regard to rebuilding the middle class, making sure that anybody who works hard can actually not only be out of poverty, but also lift their families and have a better life for themselves, like we did before. We had a social contract. Social contract. It had 3 pieces. One piece was anybody who works full-time must not be in poverty or their family. We all agreed. This is not... And that's why we have the minimum wage, why we have an earned income tax credit. That's why we work so hard. And most Americans believe this. They believe this. You know, the regressives say, oh, no, we've got to reduce the minimum wage. In fact, I heard the other day a regressive say we ought to get rid of the minimum wage altogether. That will create more jobs. Well, by that logic, if we work for pennies an hour, we'd have jobs coming out of our ears. You know, slavery was a full employment system. The object is not jobs at any price. The object is good jobs with good pay and decent working conditions and decent benefits. So you ask the candidates specifically about that, and then you also ask the candidates about another regressive mythology that propaganda has propagandized almost to the point where people believe it. It's the big lie theory. You say the big lie over and over and over again, people start believing the big lie, even though there's no logic to it. You know, the big lie here is that CEOs and the wealthy are job creators. Have you heard that? You can't raise taxes on corporations and on big corporations and on CEOs because they're the job creators. And if you do that, they will stop being the job creators. Well, you know, here's the reality. The reality is that the job creators are a large and growing middle class, including enough places for people who are poor to ascend and aspire and move into the middle class, because middle class, a large and growing and buoyant middle class, has the purchasing power to buy the stuff that businesses want to sell. And if businesses don't have customers, there are going to be no jobs. And if businesses have a lot of new customers, they're going to create jobs. This is business 101. This is economics 1. And this is why you want to not only lift the minimum wage, but why you want to lift all of the wages of everybody in the median and below and maybe above median somewhat. Why you need, this is the logic of why you need strong unions, why you need pay, because it's good for the economy. It's good for business. Businesses say, and a lot of the regressives say, oh no, we are the job creators. Corporations don't need tax cuts. They're sitting on $1.5 trillion of cash they don't even know what to do with. They're buying back their own shares of stock. They're putting their cash all over the world. They don't know what to do with it. They're not investing because there are not enough customers. And people at the top, the billionaires and the multimillionaires, they don't need any more money to create an incentive, to be incentivized. There's this bizarre propaganda machine that says somehow rich people need more money in order to have proper economic incentives, and poor people need less money. Well, that doesn't make any sense economically. You want to actually create a situation in which poor people can aspire to have more money. You want to reward work and not reward wealth. And the third and major propaganda machine issue, it's not major, it's one of the three big ones, is that somehow entitlements, you've heard entitlements, they say it. Whenever they use the word entitlement, their noses wrinkle up. Have you noticed? Entitlements. They're entitlements. We have too many entitlements. Well, I have news for them. Entitlements are social insurance in which we all pay into. Social Security, Medicare, we pay into these social insurance schemes. They are not, entitlements make it sound like they're kids who are entitled. They're kind of rich kids who are running around entitled. Let's stop using the word entitlement, please. Let's talk about what they really are. They are social insurance systems that we pay into. Started in Social Security in the 1930s, Medicare 1965. I was a trustee of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. I know of which I speak. Social Security, they want to say, is in dire straits. It's just going to go out of money. We have to raise the eligibility age. We've got to cut benefits. Baloney. You want to know how to save Social Security? In fact, we ought to expand Social Security. We ought to expand Social Security. We have too many seniors who have not had a chance to save because their wages have been suppressed and because they're getting no benefits, no pensions any longer. We used to have defined pensions in the 1950s, 1960s, and then they became, remember, defined contributions, and then they became do-it-yourself pensions, and then they became nothing. So Social Security needs to be expanded. How do we save Social Security and expand Social Security at the same time? Well, here's what we do. Right now, there is a cap on the percentage of income subjected to Social Security taxes. This year, it's going to be $118,500, which means anybody earning more than $118,500 pays nothing with regard to Social Security taxes on any dollar above $118,500. So a billionaire pays the same Social Security tax as somebody earning $118,500. Why don't we scrap the cap? And they want to say that Medicare is in trouble. Medicare is the most efficient system, social insurance system, that has been invented. It is incredibly efficient. Medicare is not the problem. Medicare, I was a trustee. I was sitting there with the actuaries looking at all these data. If you ever have a sleep problem, anybody has a problem getting to sleep, I recommend you sit in those meetings with Medicare actuaries. So I would look at the data, and the thing is that Medicare is so much more efficient than private health insurance, because private health insurance, Private health insurance is spending a fortune on advertising, on marketing, on trying to find healthy people and avoid sick people. We have the only healthcare system in the world that depends on avoiding sick people. So what we really ought to do is make it Medicare for all. That's the way we ought to go. And we can build on the Affordable Care Act. You just have, at the state exchange level, you just make sure that at each state exchange, and certain states are already on the way to doing this, you put a Medicare option right there on the exchange. And it turns out, if you do that, it turns out the mathematics, Medicare becomes cheaper. And the more people that join Medicare, the cheaper it gets out of economies of scale, because its cost structure is much better. And you allow Medicare to use its bargaining leverage to get low drug prices. You see, this is not rocket science, folks. I mean, there are a lot of other things that we could talk about. Student debt has been talked about today already. Well, I mean, the simplest thing, students are paying 12, 13, 14% on those student debts. Let them refinance at 3 or 3.5%, which they could do right now, today, if the law allowed them to do that. Okay, but I said if the law allowed them to do that. This is where the rigging comes in. Everything that I have talked about so far. And we could go down. I could talk. I belong to the Fidel Castro School of Oratory, which means I could talk for 4.5 hours, and you would miss dinner, and I'd miss my plane. My point is, no, I could go through the entire economy. I'm just giving you examples of how the rules could be changed to favor the middle class, working class, and the poor. It's not hard. What's hard is the politics, which gets back to you, which gets back to this meeting, which gets back to Iowa, which gets back to the questions you're going to ask Hillary Clinton and Bernie and anybody else. Here, well, I'm not really. First of all, I'm too short, too outspoken, and I have a constitutional inability to kiss wealthy asses. So, and the other thing is, and my wife would leave me. Other than that, but I'm gonna fight, and I've always fought, and I'm gonna continue to fight. And I think that from where I am and from the sidelines, in some ways, through books and articles and videos and films and everything else I do, I can hopefully, and through you, we can move this country. The biggest enemy we have is not the regressives. The biggest enemy we have is cynicism. Because I go around the country and I talk to people all over this country, and they don't call themselves, most people don't call themselves liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. They really don't. Or even if they do, they don't have a strong sense of the label. Most people just are fed up. They feel, with regard to their corporation, their employer, they have no power at all. They're pissed off. With regard to these big conglomerations, as consumers, they can't deal with the AT&T or Comcast or the insurance companies or their healthcare, anything. The banks, they're fed up. They can't get through the call. If you tried to get through these call menus. Or the airlines, there are now only 4 major airlines. You can't even, they have monopolies. There's so many monopolies. Let's bring back antitrust law. But most of all, people are cynical about, and this is dangerous, they're cynical about politics. This is where the regressives have won the most. They have created a country that is a democracy and one of the world's oldest and most functional democracies. It was. And they've turned us into cynics about our own government and our own political process. So most of all, when you talk to candidates, you've got to talk to them about how exactly they are going to get big money out of politics. What exactly are they going to do? What exactly are they going to do? You know, they have got to support, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission right now has petitions before it. This doesn't even, you don't have to go through Congress. The SEC has petitions before it to require all corporations to disclose fully all of their campaign contributions. Now that is, the SEC could do that tomorrow by rulemaking. Why isn't the Obama administration doing that? Why? Every candidate should be supporting that. Is simple and direct. Full disclosure generally of the sources of all campaign money. I mean, even the Supreme Court in that stupendously stupid decision, one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made, right up there with Gore against Bush and Dred Scott. The third worst decision, maybe as bad as those other two, was Citizens United and then McCutcheon. And you've got to ask the candidates, are you